In 1888, an unidentified killer murdered at least 5 women in the labyrinth of London's East End. Over the following decades, the lack of answers allowed the perpetrator to mutate from a historical criminal into a supernatural myth. Exactly a century later, the FBI's National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime received an unusual request. Supervisory Special Agent John E. Douglas was asked to build a criminal profile for a 100-year-old cold case. Building an accurate psychological profile usually relies on rich, modern forensic data. In 1888, DNA testing, blood spatter analysis, and fingerprinting did not exist. Medical examiners filed incomplete reports, and the police used crime scene photography incredibly sparingly. Agent Douglas realized he didn't need modern blood evidence to understand the killer. While investigative technology advances every decade, the underlying psychology driving a violent serial offender remains exactly the same. The specific way a killer acts out his internal desires leaves a recognizable behavioral fingerprint. The FBI approached this file exactly as they would a modern manhunt. They stripped away a century of folklore to examine the raw data left behind by a living, breathing suspect. The behavioral data begins with the victims. The killer exclusively targeted women working independently as prostitutes in dark alleys or flop houses. They drank heavily and were highly accessible. The killer didn't have to seek out and initiate contact. The victims approached him. Medical reports from the autopsies showed no evidence of physical torture prior to death. The killer utilized a swift, blitz-style attack to maintain absolute control of the victims. Once they were dead, he spent a considerable amount of time performing severe, targeted postmortem mutilations. This diagram outlines a critical concept in behavioral science, separating a killer's modus operandi from his ritual. Modus operandi, or MO, refers to the practical, physical steps an offender takes to successfully commit a crime and escape, while the ritual is the specific psychological behavior that satisfies his internal fantasy. Looking at the left column, we see the MO variables. Elements like target selection, the approach, and the initial method of attack are all learned behaviors. A killer will actively change these practical steps to become more efficient and avoid detection as he gains real-world experience. Now look at the right column. The ritual, in this case the removal of specific body organs, is rigid. The killer cannot change this aspect of the attack because acting out this exact violent fantasy is the entire reason he is committing the crime in the first place. By isolating that fixed psychological ritual from the evolving tactics, the FBI demonstrated that the killer was highly methodical. He was following a precise internal script to satisfy his desires. This map plots the exact geographic locations of the 1888 homicides. Investigators use the spatial distribution of crime scenes to track a killer's movements and understand how they react to increased police pressure. Notice what happens when we draw connecting lines between the second, third, fourth, and fifth crime scenes. They form a distinct triangular shape. Behavioral scientists call this a secondary comfort zone. Offenders actively move their attacks to a secondary geographic area when they feel the investigation heating up around their usual hunting grounds. This geographic shift indicates his primary comfort zone is right here, at the site of the very first homicide near Whitechapel Station. He either lived or worked within a few blocks of this specific epicenter. The FBI built a demographic profile of the unknown subject, or UNSUB, based on these operational constraints. They determined he was a white male between 28 and 36 years old. He looked completely ordinary, but during the murders, he wore clothing above his usual station to project wealth and easily attract his unsuspecting victims. He grew up deeply isolated, raised by a domineering mother and a passive or absent father. To safely satisfy his destructive fantasies, he sought employment where he could work alone with dead bodies. The profile suggests he earned his living as a butcher, a mortician's helper, or a medical examiner's assistant. He suffered from extreme paranoia regarding a perceived physical abnormality, perhaps a speech impediment or a scarred complexion. Because of this crippling self-image, he drank heavily in local pubs just to lower his inhibitions enough to strike. The data completely dismantles the popular folklore of a wealthy, aristocratic genius prowling the fog. The actual killer was a deeply insecure, pathetic local laborer who blended perfectly into the neighborhood. During the 1888 investigation, police and newspapers received hundreds of taunting letters, including the infamous note signed "From Hell." the FBI profile advises investigators to ignore them completely. Serial offenders matching this specific typology rarely communicate with the media or the police. He did not commit these horrific acts to challenge law enforcement or secure international publicity. His motivation was entirely internal, acting out a private fantasy. The sudden and complete end of the murders led many to assume the killer committed suicide out of guilt. The FBI rejects this. Offenders like this only stop killing if they die of natural causes, are imprisoned for a different offense, or come so close to being identified that they are forced into hiding. Agent Douglas even outlined exactly how to interrogate the killer if he were arrested today. Investigators would question him in the early morning hours, matching the time of his attacks, to ensure he felt entirely relaxed in the room. They would avoid directly accusing him at first. Instead, they would validate his twisted logic. The detectives would agree with his internal justification that the victims were garbage, and that he was simply performing a public service by removing them. Then they would spring the psychological trap. The investigators would confront him with the physiological reality that by touching the victims, he had become personally soiled by their blood. This highly specific confrontation would shatter his grandiose sense of superiority, inducing severe stress and leading to a confession. Modern behavioral science reveals a stark truth about historical mysteries. The perpetrators are rarely mythical mastermind villains. They are broken, highly predictable men following strict psychological scripts. If you want to see more scientific deep dives into historical mysteries, hit the subscribe button below, and let us know in the comments which unsolved cold case you think the FBI should profile next.